In this video, we're going to discuss the determinants of demand elasticity. Remember that when we talked about the determinants of demand, we were asking about things that could shift the demand curve around. What are things that could shift the demand curve up and to the right to increase demand? What are things that shifts demand curves down and to the left to decrease demand? Well, when we're talking about the determinants of demand elasticity, the question is, what are things that can flatten that demand curve out, make it more elastic, or steepen that demand curve and make it more inelastic? So there are 4 determinants of demand elasticity that we're going to consider in this video, and they're listed on the PowerPoint there. The existence and number of close substitutes is the first. The proportion of consumers' budgets that a good accounts for. The time span to which the demand curve pertains, and the perceived necessity or luxury status of the good. Let's go through those individually. So first of all, we have the close substitutes, the number and existence of close substitutes. And as you can see on the graph there, I have it written out that if there are many close substitutes, then the demand curve is going to be relatively flat or elastic. If a good has few close substitutes, then it's going to be a steeper demand curve. You can illustrate this with a simple example like soft drinks, okay? You have multiple different types of cola sodas, like Coke is one, Pepsi is the other. Those are the 2 best known. There's also RC Cola and then a number of lesser known brands as well, okay? Now, because there are many close substitutes for Coca-Cola, Coke has a fairly flat demand curve. Now, imagine if tomorrow Congress passed a law and the president signed it, granting the Coca-Cola Corporation a monopoly status, okay, so that no other company could sell cola soft drinks. Pepsi can't sell Pepsi Cola, RC can't sell RC Cola, and so on. Well, that would have the result of steepening the demand curve for Coca-Cola, because if a customer wanted to buy a cola soft drink, the only option they would have is Coke. So that if Coke raised their price, the customer has to either pay or just consume something completely different from a cola soft drink. Okay. On the other hand, if the U.S. government made it so that Coca-Cola had to publicly release its formula and allow any other company to use that formula and compete with them with an exact copy of its product, well, that would make the demand curve for Coca-Cola practically flat, okay? Because now there would be no distinction between what they were selling and what anybody else could sell, all right? The more close substitutes there are for a good, the easier a time consumers have finding some competitor who's selling more or less the same thing. And they're going to become more sensitive to changes in the price of that product. If there are no close substitutes or only a few of them, then consumers are going to be less sensitive to changes in price. Next up, we have consumers' budgets and how much of their budgets are spent on a particular product. And as you can see there, the more major component of a budget a product makes up, the flatter that demand curve is. That means if consumers are spending a relatively large fraction of their budget on this product, they're going to be rather sensitive or quite sensitive to changes in its price. Whereas on the right, if the good makes up a minor component of their budget, if they don't spend much of their money on this product, then their demand curve is going to be relatively inelastic. They're not going to be as sensitive to changes in price as they adjust their quantity demanded. So if you think about like major components of budget, one of those might be housing, for example. As houses get a bit more expensive, housing can make up a third to a half of a person's budget, especially their take-home pay in Southern California. And so if the price of housing goes up by 5% or 10%, that can take a real bite out of a consumer's budget. And so they're going to start looking for opportunities to cut back on the amount of housing expenditures that they need. For example, moving into smaller apartments or smaller houses, or possibly taking in roommates to reduce the amount of that price that they have to pay. All right, so consumers are going to be more responsive to changes in something like the price of cars, the price of housing. On the other hand, if the good is a minor component of your budget, like the price of number 2 pencils or the price of chewing gum, the price of milk, well, you don't spend that much of your money on those goods anyway, and so you might not notice. You're not even going to be paying as close attention to changes in the prices of that good. Third, we have the time span to which the demand curve refers, and this is just noting that on a typical demand graph, you have two dimensions. You've got the dimension of price and you have the dimension of quantity. But we don't specify usually a dimension of time. How long are we talking about? Is the demand curve in question the daily demand curve, the monthly demand curve, the yearly demand curve? And the basic point here is that in the long run, consumers have more flexibility to change their behavior in response to changes in price. So in the long run, those demand curves are going to tend to be more elastic. They'll be flatter. In the short run, consumers have a harder time, a costlier time changing their behavior, and so they will not change their consumption as much in the short run as they will in the long run. In the short run, demand curves are going to be steeper, more inelastic. Simple example of this comes from my own life as a professor here at Chapman. So when I started here about 11 years ago, actually, I was living in Moreno Valley, which is a 50-mile one-way commute from Orange. So every day I'm driving 100 miles, and I went through a lot of gasoline as I did that. Typically, I would fill up before driving home in the evening. And so you can imagine if I showed up to the gas station and let's say that the price had gone up considerably. Let's say that the price of gasoline was $5 a gallon or $6 a gallon, and that it was that high everywhere. It wasn't just at this one station. It was that way, throughout Southern California. Well, in the short run, that evening, there's not much I can do about it. I would probably still fill up my gas as long as I expected the price to stay that high, into the future. I'd probably still fill up my car with gas even if the price was that high in the short run. It wouldn't change my consumption that much. But that's just because my next best option to filling up the tank with gas would be finding a hotel to stay in Orange and just not going home that night. That's pretty costly behavior change. However, if I knew that the price was going to stay high for a long period of time, I could start making decisions that would cut back on my long-run consumption of gasoline. For example, I only teach 2 days a week, and so I could make the decision to only drive into campus on days that I had to be physically present. The other days I could use my laptop and VPN and work remotely. Also, if you gave me even more time, eventually I would move in closer to Orange, which is what I did. Once I got into my second year, I moved into Orange County. Okay, so that would also reduce the amount of gasoline that I would be using. And then eventually I'm going to buy a new car, and if gas prices are still very high, you can bet that I'm going to be buying a car that has good fuel efficiency, good gas mileage, so that I cut back my consumption of gas even further. So you can see the longer the time frame that we're looking at, the more responsive I could be to changes in the price. In the short run, I kind of have to take the price as a given, and I can't cut back my consumption by that much. But in the long run, there's a lot that I can do. So long-run demand curves are more elastic, short-run demand curves more inelastic. Finally, we have the perceived necessity of the good. If the good is considered to be a necessary good, like gasoline from my prior example, most Southern Californians consider that to be a necessity. If you want to hold down a job, if you want to be able to get your kids to school, if you want to do much of anything in Southern California, you can't rely on public transportation. You're mostly going to have to drive yourself around. And so buying gas is just a part of life. Well, if gas or any good is a necessity, then that's going to make consumers less responsive to a change in the price. And that demand curve is going to be relatively steep and inelastic. On the other hand, goods that are considered luxury goods, things like ocean cruises, like I mentioned before, buying yachts, buying a particular luxury brand of car, that demand curve is going to be more elastic. It's going to be flatter, because if the price of a yacht goes up by 5%, I could easily say, you know what? I don't have to buy a yacht. I don't need that. I could buy something else instead. Or if the price of a Jaguar goes up, or the price of a BMW goes up, or a Porsche, or a Maserati, I can always say, you know what? I don't have to have a luxury car, Instead, I could buy a cheaper car that can do the job just as well. All right. So if a good is considered a luxury, it's going to have a more elastic demand curve. I do want to point out, though, that what good is considered a luxury and what good is considered a necessity can change over time. So, for example, think about an internet connection. For the most part, people now consider their internet connection to be like a utility, like having water hooked up to your house or a sewage system. Okay, it's a necessity. You don't live a modern lifestyle without a good internet connection. That wasn't always the case. Back when I was an undergraduate, internet connection, I mean, yes, we had email, but, and I don't even know if Google was around at the time. I know eBay came around just, midway through my undergraduate career. Okay, so there wasn't that much to be done on the internet like there is today. And so it was more or less a luxury. If you didn't have an internet connection, maybe that was a little bit uncommon, but you weren't missing that much by not having the internet. Today we consider it a necessity. On the flip side, you can think of goods that used to be considered necessities, but now they're a luxury good. For example, horses. 1800s, if you didn't own a horse, that was a significant liability for you. You didn't have great, reliable transportation. So owning a horse was a necessity, especially if you were in agriculture back in the 1800s. But today, nobody needs to have a horse. The only people who own horses are either fairly wealthy, or if they're middle class, they just have a love of horses and they're willing to give up a lot of consumption of other goods instead. Okay, so that perception isn't stable. Well, it might be stable over the medium term, but over long time horizons, people can change their mind about what is a necessity and what is a luxury.